Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning and good evening, depending on wherever you're tuning in at the moment. Welcome to the event today on the transatlantic relations on Iran after the US election. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you for this online debate that we'll have. My name is Cornelius Adebar. I'm with Carnegie Europe in Brussels, but we have assembled here a host of experts and we will discuss the issue for the next 1 hour. I'm very pleased to do this in collaboration with Lucy in London. Good morning and good evening, depending on wherever you're tuning in at the moment. Welcome to the event today on the transatlantic relations on Iran after the US election. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you for this online debate that we'll have. My name is Cornelius Adebar. I'm with Carnegie Europe in Brussels, but we have assembled here a host of experts and we will discuss the issue for the next That was my mistake. I apologize. I do understand that I was hearing myself. Apologies for this rookie mistake. I thought I was only on Zoom. So you've heard me twice welcome you, which is double to the extent how heartfelt it is. We will discuss the issue of transatlantic relations and Iran with our distinguished experts, which I'm happy to introduce. No particular order except where people live. Out west, Jared Blank from the United States, a former State Department official working on the JCPOA and now with Carnegie Endowment in Washington, DC. Tom Tugendhat, a member of the British Parliament and chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. My dear colleague Anissé Tabrizi, with whom I'm organizing this with Rusi in London, and Dr. Nathalie Tocci, the director of the IAI in Rome and also an advisor to the High Representative for Foreign and Security Affairs of the European Union. Welcome to you all. We'd like to dive into the topic, but before I do so, I will just warn you, as you've realized, the event is being live streamed, so people can see it through the Rusi website, through Facebook, and it will also be recorded so that people can access it after the fact through the website. And we're very much looking forward to your questions, comments, and ideas, which you are happy to post in the chat, which we will then include in the conversation with our experts. We will do a short taking a look back at the past 4 years, because this major event, the US election, is coming up shortly. And then we will look at the scenarios which we are presented with when it comes to the outcome of that election. Looking back 4 years ago, the JCPOA was possibly thriving, could have thrived under if there had been a different outcome of the US election. 2.5 years ago, the United States left the deal, and here we are with a barely alive agreement. My first question to Tom Tugendhat would principally be, the European Union, which is the E3, including United Kingdom and France and Germany, have set out to present and to preserve the deal. How well have they done this over the past 4 years?
Good morning, afternoon, and evening, depending on where you are. First of all, I would say it's not the European Union. The E3 is specifically not an EU project. It's Germany, France, and the UK. And the answer is mixed. And the JCPOA, in many ways, is really hanging by a thread. It's been violated now by the Iranian regime in various different ways, which the IAEA has already reported on. And of course, the United States, the principal actor, in reality, the principal second party in the agreement, has withdrawn. So it's hard to see how much life is left in it, and really we'll find out how much life is left in it on Tuesday next week, or rather probably on Wednesday or Thursday next week when we start to get the results of the United States election. But it's certainly questionable to decide whether or not there's much in it. And within Iran itself, the position of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps has changed significantly over the last few years, and that means that even were a new US administration to decide that it really wanted to reawaken the agreement, it's questionable as to whether or not the Iranian government would be willing to make the counterparties necessary to revive it.
Natalie, for a different European view, you've been part of the negotiations and advising the High Representative. Would you describe the agreement as alive enough to build on it? Should there be an outcome next week that would allow for that?
Yeah, well, I mean, to clarify, I've not been involved in the negotiations. I mean, obviously, I have been working both with the previous High Representative and with the current one, but not on this specific dossier. But I think sort of, looking back, I would say that in a sense, sort of two key words stand out in looking at the European, and I would include in different ways, and I'll come to this, both the E3 and the EU, which of course in different ways have all been involved. The sort of two key words that stand out for me are really, on the one hand, stubbornness and or resilience to a degree, but also weakness on the other hand. So I think we have been stubborn in our support for the JCPOA, and that stubbornness has been sufficient not to lead to a complete collapse of the JCPOA. So I would agree that this is on, this is an agreement on life support, not so much because of what we've done, but we did manage to, in a sense, prevent an outright collapse, which, mind you, could have happened, as late as last month. I mean, if we had gone all the way in following the United States in terms of its approach to renew the arms embargo, or let alone the snapback of sanctions, then that would have been the definitive end of the JCPOA. So there's been, I think, a degree of kind of resilience and stubbornness. But I think that one also shouldn't hide away from the fact that this has been a story of weakness. And mind you, I think that weakness has been mainly an E3 weakness more than an EU weakness, because the roles were fundamentally different. Who ultimately had to deliver in terms of sanctions relief were the E3. Instincts, for that matter, is something that has been very much member state driven, and it should have been member state driven. And as we know, it has failed in its intent. There was only one transaction that took place to date. And it has failed because ultimately we have been unable to stand up to the United States in this respect. So I think this is a story of weakness and of stubbornness, which means that this is really a story of a glass half full and half empty. But to come to your question, Cornelius, I mean, I would say that yes, there is obviously a scenario whereby the JCPOA has an opportunity to survive. Candidate Biden has been very explicit in this respect. It is not just a desire to want to return to the JCPOA, but it's a desire for a sort of clean compliance for compliance scenario. Now, we can get to this later, easier said than done, but the intention is very clear. And so there is a potential European role. And I think in this respect, I think there is more of an EU than an E3 role, because I think this is mainly a US-Iran story, where it's facilitation between the two, which is most needed, that could play a role. Now, obviously, if we are in a Trump scenario, this is, and it will be the definitive end of the JCPOA. But again,
we'll come to that, Natalie. Thank you. And we'll also dive deeper into the E3 versus EU role, I believe, when we look at those scenarios. But I do like your description of stubbornness and weakness on the side of the Europeans. Let me put it like this, and throw it to Jared. Stubbornness and weakness, in a way, is also how one could describe the United States policy. Stubborn in its pursuit of maximum pressure, I would say, but also weakness in terms of possibly not achieving the goals that were related to it. How would you describe it?
Well, maybe before I answer that question, Cornelius, I'd like to say that I actually have a generally more positive take on what the EU and the E3 have achieved over the course of the last couple of years. I think that if you look at the heart of the JCPOA, it is the main protagonists are the United States and Iran. And so if the United States and Iran have decided to cease compliance with the deal, or if the United States has decided to cease compliance and then Iran is, sort of feels compelled to respond in some way, keeping the shell of the deal alive, or keeping the deal on life support, or hanging by thread, or whatever metaphor you want to use, is actually quite an accomplishment for an actor in the deal who's not the protagonist, right? So what I would say is that, okay, stubbornness is a good word, weakness is a good word. I think that there's been quite a bit of realism and cleverness in the way that the Brussels and the E3 foreign ministries have assessed the situation, and on almost a day-to-day basis kind of found the next move, and eventually sort of found the way through, so that here we are at the end of October 2020 with the possibility of a return to the JCPOA, which certainly the architects of the US withdrawal from the JCPOA in 2018 absolutely discounted. And a lot of, and this moves us, Cornelius, to your question about US weakness and stubbornness in this. I think a lot of the US failure in this policy has been a couple-fold. One is that the US the Trump administration failed to set clear, let alone realistic objectives for its Iran policy in starting this whole thing. And so never really went through a disciplined process of identifying where our points of leverage are, what our key priorities would be, and how we would line the two up. But instead, just, sort of described, I would say, a fanciful outcome, and then proceeded to find points of economic pressure in order to try to achieve that outcome in ways that I never think made any strategic or tactical sense. And then second, sort of, realism in the nature of the United States relationship to other key actors, including Europe, so that up until, really August, with the Trump administration's play on snapback, I think that Washington was constantly misassessing how its moves would be interpreted and responded to, in a way that, again, has left this opening to keep the JCPOA in some form or another alive and a question moving forward.
Thank you, Jared. And it doesn't happen often that the EU gets so much credit for its role. But let me dwell on this for just one more moment on the last 4 years. And Anise, the issue of trust in transatlantic relations after those 4 years, where those two sides, the EU somewhat united, and the United States determined in its pursuit to kill the deal. What trust is there currently, Anise, would you say, to build on, whichever outcome we can look at? But where are we on this file, and how closely can the two sides, United States and the Europeans, E3, EU, work together still?
Thanks, Cornelius. I think you hit the nail, really, like bringing up the issue of trust, because this is, I think, the biggest issue with the past 4 years. So we have lack of trust, not just between the US and Iran, which was already the case, but also between Iran and Europe, precisely because of the weakness point that was raised by Natalie, and also between Europe and the United States. I think we are at the low in terms of transatlantic cooperation. We are at a low in terms of transatlantic understanding and trust in the future strategy on Iran. Even if a Biden administration comes in, I think this issue of trust, of rebuilding trust on all three fronts, is going to be the main issue. And bear in mind, we had situations in which there have been already, disagreements or divergences on Iran, specifically between the US and Europe before. But I think the situation that we have witnessed over the past 4 years, in which the US has actually actively taken policy that disrupted the European attempts to meet its strategic interests, was quite unprecedented to the European side. So I think to unravel that, it will take concrete steps. And from the Iranian side, the Iranian leaders are already saying that while the political capital was enough over the past couple of years to mitigate some of the concern, to even convince Iran to remain a party of the JCPOA, up until now, these political commitments are not enough, are not going to be enough, even in a Biden administration to convince Iran that that is the case, especially when you put that into the timeline of the Iranian scenario. We have presidential elections coming in. We have a very strong pressure on the presidency on taking actions in response to what has happened over the past 4 years, but especially over the past few months with snapback, the extension of the arms embargo, and now even more sanctions on the petrochemical sector and the banking sector by the Trump administration. So I think it's going to be a tough challenge, whatever happens with the US elections.
Thank you, and that's definitely an assessment that needs to be made when looking forward. Because we're getting warmed up here, I would like to once more encourage the audience to come up with questions through the chat, questions and comments, but also invite my speakers. If you do want to directly intervene, please just raise a hand. I can see you all at this point. Otherwise, I keep throwing questions at you. Tom Tugendhat, you came out over the summer in defense of the US position on the arms embargo and arguing against the European stance of trying to find a compromise or to not issue a snapback. To what extent, depending on how things go next week, to what extent do you feel the US election is also a validation of different approaches? So to say, the European approach to the Iran deal or the most recent US under Trump approach?
First of all, I'd just say I didn't come out in defense of the US approach. I came out in favor of a British approach, which would be to the US does whatever it wants. That's up to the president and the people of the United States. That's not my concern. My concern is what the British people and the British government should do. And I came out in support of recognizing what the agreement says, and as I said earlier, recognizing the IAEA's report on violations, and therefore engaging the snapback mechanisms that are part of the existing agreement. What a US, what the change in the United States administration may mean, depending on a Biden victory, I think is open to question. But it is hard, I would suggest, even for an incoming Biden administration, to ignore the reports that have come out of the IAEA in recent months. And therefore, although there may well be, as Jared has already suggested, a way of looking again at the JCPOA and seeing if it can be revived in some ways, I think it is hard for any US administration not to look at the Iranian government's decisions in recent months and years in a positive light. I mean, it is in clear violation of its initial agreements.
Well then, let's hear from Jared. You're at least physically close to the US government. And what are the thoughts that you're hearing on how to reconcile the fundamental readiness to re-engage with Iran, to see whatever reviving of the deal is possible, but at the same time, this period of also increased Iranian negligence of the deal, of violations, as was mentioned and certified in IAEA reports. What could be the Biden team's approach to Iran over the next couple of months? Jared.
So, we're lucky here. I'm incapable of speaking on behalf of Vice President Biden or his campaign, but I don't need to because he's spoken quite clearly on his own behalf in an op-ed that was published on the CNN website a few weeks ago, but regularly actually over the course of the campaign. And this is an issue to the extent that foreign policy was raised during Democratic Party primary debates. This was one of the only issues to come up regularly. Vice President Biden has been consistent and clear in his position, which is that he supports a compliance for compliance return to the JCPOA, followed by further diplomacy with and about Iran to address all of the other points of concern that exist between the United States and Iran. And so that's very far from ignoring the fact that Iran is out of compliance with the JCPOA. It's quite explicitly the United States will return to compliance in some kind of agreed fashion if Iran also will return to compliance. I don't know if you want to talk about this now or later. I mean, we can speculate as to what the Iranian response or policy toward that might be. But if Vice President Biden is elected, I think we can make a pretty solid guess as to what the United States will try first, simply because, and this is going to sound out of step with our cynical times, but US presidential candidates, when elected, generally try to do what they say they're going to do. And Vice President Biden has said what he's going to do here. And I think that we should, we can talk about how that might or might not work, but we can expect him to try to do it.
Okay. There is one question in the chat precisely about what would Joe Biden do with regards to human rights violations, Iran sponsoring terrorism, because there's one thing about reviving and re-entering, as it were, the JCPOA on the US side. But how do you square that with the blatant violations of human rights in the country or the sponsoring of terrorism as it's alleged? Where does that figure on the list of priorities for a Biden administration?
Well, anytime that the JCPOA is critiqued from the perspective of the issues that it did not address between the United States and Iran or the world and Iran, my response is always to say, if you believe that the only acceptable diplomatic outcome between the US and the international community and Iran is a resolution of every point of concern between us, then what you're actually saying is that there is no acceptable path for diplomacy with Iran. Because I challenge anybody to find an example in history where a country with as many, points of friction with the United States or with the international community as Iran has resolved them all in one go, short of total defeat in war. And so there was a decision made by the international community with broad bipartisan support in the United States, now dating back almost 15 years, that the most urgent priority was to address Iran's nuclear file. And so a tremendous amount of diplomatic effort went into building up an international sort of consensus, UN-based pressure in order to come to a conclusion that would restrict and monitor Iran's nuclear program. That was successfully achieved through the JPOA and the JCPOA. And I think that the core Biden point is we need to go back to that platform, because without doing so, we still have this, glaring overarching priority unsolved, which leaves us really unable to focus on any of the other problems, because we are going to rightly turn our attention to the agreed top priority. Once we've got the top priority again sort of put in a box by the JCPOA, then we've not handed away all of our tools. We can then turn to using diplomatic means to address all of these other points of concern.
Thank you. Over to Natalie. How would the Europeans be ready to engage with a Biden administration, which then wants to re-enter the deal? And just, an additional question, because it's in the chat, how would the re-entry into the JCPOA not give Iran an upper hand, either in the negotiations or maybe, morally, because they can, in the renegotiation, they could try to go for a lower standard. That is one of the questions. If you can try to, answer those two. Thanks.
Well, I think, this is a sort of step-by-step process. Unfortunately, one has to start from the trust question that Anise was raising. And unfortunately, I don't think there's any hiding away from the fact that we are in a different and in a more difficult predicament that we were pre-JCPOA. And what I mean by this is that whereas pre-JCPOA, the working hypothesis, in a sense almost accepted by Iran itself, was that the negotiation and the agreement had to be constructed in a way so as to ensure that there would not be cheating by one side, and that one side was Iran itself. And unfortunately, we're not in that world anymore, because unfortunately the cheating has happened, and of course, as we all know, it happened and started on the other side. And so I think the first step, even before we get into how can Europeans sort of facilitate a compliance for compliance story, there would have to be the sort of pre-step of even persuading Iranians that even engaging in this process is a good thing. I've heard Iranians debate whether they would even want the United States to be back into the JCPOA because of a concern that the only reason why even a Biden administration would want to return to the JCPOA is to return in order to activate snapback. So this is how bad things are in terms of trust. So I think that's a sort of a pre-step that would need to be made even to begin to engage in this process. Now, if we get there, and I think we would get there, because I think, if Iranians have stayed into the deal up until now is because ultimately there is a willingness to try and explore the possibility for this construct, in a sense, to come back together again. Then I think that there is an important facilitation role that Europeans can play, and this is why here, and I'll come back to this later, I do make the distinction in this respect between the E3 and the EU, in terms of assisting. Ultimately, what are the two main parties to this agreement? And this has become far clearer now than it was 4 or 5 years ago, which are precisely the United States and Iran, to try and understand how is it, what are the steps in this process? So exactly what are the guarantees that Iran would provide so that it would begin by freezing and then reversing the steps in terms of the reduction of JCPOA implementation, so non-implementation and non-compliance has taken place. What are the steps in the US? What does it mean for the United States to fully return to its commitment? Exactly what qualifies as nuclear as opposed to non-nuclear related sanctions? This gets us into the whole debate of sort of backdoor sanctions over the last couple of years. So, what do we foresee along the way, just to get back to an entirely insufficient place, which is full compliance for compliance? Once we get there, there is obviously everything else that needs to be done. And that everything else, beginning with the nuclear file, beginning with the renegotiation of the sunset clauses, and then everything else that was not done. And particularly, I've got little faith into discussing missiles, but I do think that there is an important conversation to be had as far as regional questions are concerned. So, this is a sequence that will require, I think, mainly European facilitation. And perhaps here the sort of point that I did want to make about the sort of E3 EU distinction, I think Annie says absolutely right. Iranians don't see bad faith in Europeans, but they do see weakness. Now, the EU as an actor was never really supposed to be a power actor in this game. It was supposed to be a facilitator. Those that were viewed as bringing potentially power assets, if you like, to the negotiation were the E3, and they proved unable to do so. So I think in a context where now, the emperor's got no clothes, we kind of know who we are respectively, good and bad, strengths and weaknesses. I think that there is a greater EU role to be played in terms of facilitation than an E3 game, which was very much the game of the last couple of years, which, as we were saying earlier, yes, perhaps was sufficient in maintaining the shell, as Jarrett was saying, but exposed our weaknesses in many respects.
Okay. And so that is something where what you can be working on also over the next years. Then, Anise, we've talked a lot about Iran and possible Iranian reactions. We do have a couple of questions also in the chat on, for example, the role of the IRGC, on what a new Iranian government, I presume after the presidential election in 2021, what this new Iranian government might do and might not do, or whether it would stick to a deal which would then be, an interim deal concluded by then. Tell us a little bit more, because you're following events also in Iran. Tell us a little bit more about the mood there vis-a-vis a re-engagement.
Easy. Well, I think re-engagement is definitely not completely off the table. I think the question is what is going to be the environment in which this negotiation will start, starting from who is going to be the president, but in the United States, but also what are going to be the conditions put on the table. I think, as everybody has said before, compliance for compliance is seems to be definitely something that their Iranian government and administration is thinking about, but compliance for compliance in itself doesn't seem to be sufficient. We have seen the foreign minister talking about compensation a few times, compensation, for the damages incurred by Iran since the US withdrawal and the introduction of the US sanctions. I think this is going to be in the cards from the Iranian side for sure. There is definitely, as much as we have learned about the kind of mistakes conducted in the past in terms of, or mistakes or weaknesses, if you wish, in terms of inclusion of actors, inclusion of topics, all of that from the E3 and the US side. The Iranian side has learned that without a U-turn transaction, for instance, any kind of sanction relief, it's useless. They are going to push on that. They also understood that having the US out of the JCPOA is a weakness, but also some sort of leverage, as we have seen, for instance, with the reintroduction of the snapback, but also the extension of the arms embargo. There is, the two sides of the coin that Iran has seen over the past few months and a couple of years, actually. So I think they're going to address and assess the situation after the US election next week and see what is offered on the cards. I think one thing that is clear is that, first of all, while we might be talking about more for more, broadening up of the issues, bringing in the missiles, the regional factors, all that have been discussed so far, I think it's clear that from the Iranian side, this is a no-go, and I think it's going to be a very challenging thing to do, especially at the beginning. So I think a compartmentalization of the nuclear issue, at least at the beginning, and something that Natalie defined as a step-by-step approach, but also a kind of topic-by-topic approach, I would say. The two things going hand hand in hand, I think it's definitely something that needs to be considered, because the Iranians are not really willing to discuss issues that are considered for them as defining their security, especially in a situation in which they have been feeling as threatened security-wise by the US politics and actions, but also by those of the allies in the region. So I think discussing a more for more or a broadening up of the discussion into other topics is going to be challenging, and it's going to be only dependent on a resolution or improvement of the nuclear issue first.
And just quickly, the role of the IRGC, how can that be taken into account?
Yes, I think that is a very good question. I think when it comes to the Iranian elections and how that could change the calculation, I think, again, I wouldn't completely discard the opening up to negotiation. We have to remember the Iranian decision-making system is very complicated and it's not top down just by the supreme leader. And yes, there is, like the administration define the tactical approach, but whatever decision is taken ultimately is mainly defined by a consensus. So if the Iranians go ahead with opening up to the negotiation, I don't think there is going to be a complete revisit of that in terms of the strategic direction. It might be in terms of tactical approach, similarly to what we have seen during the Ahmadinejad administration. Negotiation continued. Obviously, the kind of stance that the Iranian administration took between 2005 and 2013 was completely different in terms of having more or less compliance with the IAEA, additional protocol, all of that. So I think if there is going to be a movement over the next six months, especially right after the US elections, that could open up prospects for also the next administration, Iranian administration, whoever might be in charge, also to continue the line taken over the next few months. Otherwise, if nothing happens or if the situation even worsens, then I think there will be more leverage for the next administration, probably a hardliner one, to define the direction in strategic and tactical terms.
Thank you. So you're saying that the reaction of Iran also depends on what comes out of the United States next week, and also the possible success of some negotiations. Before I turn to Tom Tugendhat, Jared had a two-finger quick response, and then I have a couple of questions also in the Q&A on the UK's role. Jared first.
Well, so first of all, I mean, I completely agree that this idea of sort of more for more JCPOA plus, it's a misunderstanding of the nature of the points of friction between us, right? That the JCPOA, the United States made economic concessions, Iran made what we perceived as national security concessions, but they really didn't, because the nuclear program is not core to their sense of either national or regime defense. The other things that we're talking about, ballistic missiles, regional proxies, are. And so the idea of just sort of an expanded JCPOA with more sanctions on the table, that doesn't work. It's got to be, if you're going to talk about those issues in a diplomatic context, you've actually got to talk about the regional security issues that worry Iran. And that is inherently a much, much longer and more complicated conversation, which is, I think, why Vice President Biden has this idea, go back into the JCPOA, cool off the tension a little bit, and then that creates potentially difficult, but potentially space for these other dialogues. I apologize, this goes a little bit more than a two-finger, but I do quickly want to say, well, I don't want to speculate, enormously about Iranian politics. There are some reasons to, there's a kind of a knowing presumption that, well, Iran has there are too many reasons Iran wouldn't want to come back in. I would just point to three things that might make it hard for Iran to say no, or at least hard to predict that they would say no. One is that they have paid a real political cost to keep the JCPOA, in this sort of half form alive over the course of the last 2.5 years. There are a few reasons you might, propose for why they've done that, but it seems to me that the most likely reason is that they potentially want to go back in. The second is that the United States would be offering in a compliance for compliance return, limited but profound economic benefits for a country that right now is struggling with, a hyperinflation, inability to access international markets for critical goods. Like, there are reasons that Iran would have, a hard time saying no to any of that. They might, but it'd be hard. And then lastly, I do think it's critical that people understand that in a Biden administration, Iran is not choosing between the status quo and going back into the JCPOA. If Biden makes a compliance for compliance offer and Iran says no or doesn't, is non-responsive, I don't think that Europe stays where they are now, kind of trying to keep this thing alive, right? At that point, they've kept it alive. The United States has done what they hoped we would do. And presumably Iran finds itself exactly where it doesn't want to be, outside of the JCPOA and completely isolated from Europe. So the decision point there is not, can we keep, winning battles against the United States at the Security Council? No, you won't. If the US tries for compliance and Iran is not helpful, then, the situation looks much uglier diplomatically for them than it does right now.
Thank you. I asked for questions. The questions are coming in through the Q&A. I will try to do justice to them, but we're working under the presumption that anything that our audience addresses is somehow of interest to you. So forgive me if I cannot, file in all the questions. To Tom Tugendhat, there was one clarification requested about Iranian compliance. Why does Iran violate has Iran violated the JCPOA when there are IAEA reports going to the contrary? So just a point of clarification on this. And on the case of Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, can this be as a political bargaining chip, especially vis-a-vis Iran and the UK's relations on those two issues?
So I don't have the papers in front of me, forgive me, but there were reports on further intensification of the uranium work, and there have been various IAEA reports on that. And on the hostage taking that the Iranian government has done for political gain. I mean, the Iranian government keeps trying to use hostages that it takes as bargaining chips for political gain. This isn't new. It did it, it's been doing it for many years, and indeed it got quite a lot of money out of various administrations, which it then spent on the Syrian war a few years ago. So, I mean, we can try, but the reality is every time that a hostage is released, they just take another one a few months later and seek to use the same leverage again.
All right, Natalie, you're off, but I'll start with Anise. Sorry, Natalie, there you are. There was a question about what role Russia and China might play. So if you want to take a look at the broader picture, and after which I will go to Anise for the regional outlook and Iran's regional activities, because we've had that in the chat. But first, Natalie, the other JCPOA partners, we're talking about Iran, United States, and Europeans as possible mediators, but there are more powers sitting at the table. What are they up to? How would they, respond to any advances made, say, from Washington or the Europeans?
I mean, I think, again, you know, if one goes back, and by the way, I just wanted to say that I thought everything that Jarrett was saying earlier was absolutely spot on. I completely agree that, you know, it would be very difficult, and it would just be nonsensical for the Iranians to put themselves in the sort of pariah spot when, for the first time in, you know, since 1979, they were basically on the side of the international community. So I completely agree with his assessment. But coming to this broader global question, I mean, I think if it's true that the last couple of years have really proved, I mean, in a sense that they've kind of revealed things as they are. So yes, they have revealed, you know, the US's ability to inflict unilateral pain. They have also revealed the limits of the United States, bringing along the rest of the international community with them. They have revealed European weakness, but also, I would say, European good faith. I think also when it comes to China and Russia, frankly speaking, it has become perhaps even clearer now than it was, you know, 4 or 5 years ago, that these are, when it comes to the nuclear file, these are not the prime actors, and they will continue not to be. So if anything, I would expect in a world in which the US wants to return to the deal, the Iranians want this to happen, but it's kind of, you know, on both sides, easier said than done. And therefore, there is the potential for European facilitation in this. I don't see, frankly speaking, Russia and China playing much of a role, which does not mean to say that Russia and China do not play a role. I think they do, and they will do, particularly if we get from the stage of returning to full compliance, moving on to a phase in which we actually further work on the nuclear file, particularly on the sunset clauses, into a world in which we, and when it's a different negotiation, I completely agree, because there it is a sort of security for security negotiation when we come to regional questions. Now, on that negotiation, I do think that obviously the Russians and the Chinese will play a far more prominent role than they do on the nuclear question.
Okay, and well, they definitely could play hard to get, even though they may not have such a big stake. But Anisi, there is a question about Iran's regional activities, the role of regional powers. How can this be tied into any future negotiations? Building possibly also on the previous question about the IRGC. How do you view that?
Right. So I think first of all, in terms of the regional posture on renewed negotiations, I think it's needless to say that Saudi Arabia, Israel won't be happy about that if there is no regional component. So again, like here, the compartmentalization of the nuclear issue, but also a parallel discussion about a regional security framework ideally would be the way forward. And I think this is also the direction in which we are likely to see Iran buy in. I think singling out Iran as the regional concern, the problem when it comes to its behavior, its interference in the region is not going to be a way forward from the Iranian side, especially from the IRGC side. But I think the problem from the more imminent compliance for compliance or nuclear related negotiation is that there is going to be a lot of pushback from Saudi Arabia and Israel. Along the lines of what we have seen pre-JCPOA or during the negotiation over the JCPOA, you know, a lot of concerns raised about the nuclear negotiation bringing in money that Iran can use for its aggressive or destabilizing behavior in the region. And I think what we have seen over the past couple of years, especially since the maximum pressure campaign, is really that it's not a matter of resources, and that is not what shapes really the Iranian actions in the region. We have seen, you know, probably the most unprecedented level of sanctions adopted against Iran, and yet what we have seen, especially since May 2019, is probably the most aggressive behavior adopted by Iran in the region. So I think there needs to be a shift in the understanding of what shapes really the Iranian policy in the region. And we see over the past couple of months, especially over the past month, that Iran, for instance, looking at the prospect for re-engagement, prospect of negotiation, and the outcome of the US election, has really directed all its allies in the region, proxies, however you want to call it, to hold off and basically bite the bullet until we see what happens. And this is a further indication that they are not really excluding opening up to negotiation following the US elections, but they might again start taking the action that we have seen, especially since May 2019, should the outcome not be in line of renewed prospect for engagement.
Thank you. And I would like us not to be too complacent, because right now we're only just talking about or discussing the Biden, a possible Biden administration. So I'll come to that point in just a minute. But there were two questions also in the chat, which I'd like to direct to Jared, who wants to come in on Russia, China. But two questions from the chat. One about the quick wins for US and Iran in starting this kind of a dialogue, re-entering a dialogue. And the other one about possible guarantees in any future deal that can make the deal more lasting. Is there anything that we learned from this previous attempt to negotiate a deal that would have to be done better next time around? So these points, Jared, thanks.
Well, so just before I turn to these, and as I said, on Russia and China, I do want to say I really agree with Natalie that there's a, if I said before, the US and Iran are the protagonists, the Europeans have kind of an overarching political or strategic role, but the Russians and the Chinese do have these discrete roles, which, while sort of, they're less public in a certain way, they're absolutely essential and close to irreplaceable. So on the Russian, there are a number of them. I'll just name one for each. On the Russian side, it's coordination with the Iranians on coming back into compliance. So if you look at the things that Iran would have to do to meet their nuclear obligations, they could do them all on their own, but there's a couple in particular where having active Russian technical cooperation would be immensely helpful. And on the Chinese side, and this gets us into the issue of quick wins, right? One of the things that Iran really is going to need out of a compliance for compliance return is getting their oil back on the market. They've got a tremendous amount in floating storage right now. They've got a tremendous amount in storage on land. They will want to be able to demonstrate that they're selling oil well above the trickle that they've got right now. The most likely place for those first shipments to go is China. And so the question of how China interacts with this, which is both economic and political, I think will be quite important. This also does trend into the kind of where are the Europeans on all of this? We learned, the United States and Europe learned a great deal about the economics, the plumbing of JCPOA implementation in 2016. And we would need to apply those lessons fairly quickly in 2021 in order to make this potentially work. And so that has to do with how Iran gets access to currently frozen bank accounts held abroad. And it also has to do with how you deal with some of the really tricky market questions of getting oil, of moving oil. So how do shipping companies interact with the changed sanction environment, insurance companies? A lot of these issues have to do with, well, largely with London, but with all of the E3 capitals. And so those are all places where close US E3 coordination, EU coordination would really be essential to getting the sorts of quick wins that I think would make it attractive for anybody to come back into the JCPOA. On this question of guarantees, look, I mean, nothing in life is guaranteed. As somebody said at the beginning, the JCPOA was originally negotiated with the idea that the party most likely to defect was Iran, and that is proven not to be the case. It's not necessarily not the case the second time around, right? I mean, so I think the bottom line is that if you were to try to reopen this agreement in any way, whether it's to change the sunsets or address ballistic missiles or change the list of sanctions relieved or create new guarantees, what you're really saying is, let's negotiate a new agreement. And we all know what it's like to negotiate with this agreement. It's a multi-year process that doesn't serve any of our interests. And so the anti-room for diplomacy here is getting back to the JCPOA as it is, and then learning the lessons that we have from that experience in order to think through future diplomatic agreements that address the future of the nuclear program and all of the other issues between us.
Thank you. As I announced before, let me start the last round of tough questions with Tom Tugendhat once more. You explained that you outlined a British approach in your paper over the summer. If we envisage a Trump win next week, how much room is there for a British or a European or a British-inspired European approach if we envisage a second Trump administration? Or don't the Europeans just have to fall into line?
Well, I think the first thing to say is if there is a Trump win, then that's it. There is no JCPOA. I think it's very difficult to envision an Iranian regime of any color, stripe, or whatever waiting another 4 years in the off chance that something might change. I think we can pretty reliably say that's that for the JCPOA. What it means for agreements with Iran, or what it means for an Iranian peace process, or whatever you want to call it, an outreach to Iran, I think is still open to question. The pressures on the Iranian state are very real. They're not changing. Coronavirus is doing huge damage to the domestic economy, the oil sanctions, the medical, the sanctions in finance and everything else is doing enormous damage to the Iranian people. And the pressure on the Iranian state to adapt is growing. And we see this with uprisings all the way, well, across the whole country, frankly. Minor, admittedly, and regularly crushed, but still, they're there. So the question then is, what are you really looking at? And I think this is where we're into a different conversation, and a conversation that's more likely to be a regional one, whether or not it's led by countries like Qatar, or rather enabled, forgive me, rather than led by, enabled by countries like Qatar, is open to question. But you're into a very, very different world if there's a Trump victory, because everything that we've just been discussing becomes completely irrelevant.
Well, that's why it's still worthwhile discussing. But over to Natalie. In this different world, what would the Europeans do? Would we still speak of E3 unity? Is this still something to look at? What is the scenario for your perspective?
Well, I mean, I agree with Tom's starting point. I don't think that it would be reasonable to assume a survival of the JCPOA. So we're in a post-JCPOA world. And I think that the first question that Europeans would be asking themselves is how to preserve the only thing that is really left. And the only thing that is really left are IAEA inspections. Now, something would have to be given in return for that. So I think that we would be in what may end up being a negotiation that does not include the United States, because I think it'd be reasonable to assume that this is not something that the Trump administration would want, a second Trump administration. I mean, there's nothing that makes me think that a second Trump administration is different from the first in this respect. Whereas I do think that there could be scope for something which is not particularly ambitious, a European-Iranian negotiation in which our desiderata would be a sort of retention of full access by IAEA inspections, for which we would have to give something in return. And that something in return, I think, can be carved out in the context of the next multi-annual financial framework. In the current cycle now ending, there was a very limited amount of money, 30 million, that could be dedicated, that was dedicated to Iran for technical assistance programs of different shapes and forms. I think it would not be unreasonable to assume that that could be enlarged somewhat, to sort of work on relatively harmless things like agriculture and climate and energy transition, etc. So nothing huge, but because because of the situation, because of the need that also Iran has, it could be that a deal, a very limited deal of that kind, could be sought. Given that anything more significant, and here, as I said, I agree with Tom, is probably off the cards.
Thank you. Jared, give us some thoughts. You know, if Trump is re-elected, what is the comparative form of maximum pressure? How can you make more maximum pressure? And what room is there for the Europeans?
Do I have to?
Yes.
Well, look, I'll say two things. First of all, on the U.S. side of this, I mean, we're in a very unusual situation in U.S. politics where on not just this issue, but on almost every issue, the challengers' preferred policy options are much clearer than the incumbents. We don't know what Trump would do on almost anything. There's no Republican Party platform. So, you know, we can talk about, we can dissect the various camps inside the Trump administration and the arguments they've had about Iran and the ways in which they might evolve in a second term, but I've got no idea. I mean, you know, so I think it's one thing to just bear in mind is that under Trump administration and under round 2 of a Trump administration, there's just going to be a tremendous opportunity, a tremendous chance of surprise on this and every other policy space. On the European side, I guess I don't think, Cornelius, the thing that it's that Europe would have to fall into line with the United States. I think that the question is, it's not an Iran question. It's how does Europe assess its role in the world and its relationship to the United States under the circumstances of a second Trump administration. And if it decides that there needs to be a change or that a change has occurred and that Europe has to respond, then how does Iran policy fit into that? It's, you know, presumably not the top of the list in terms of importance, but for domestic political reasons, it might be an easy way for you guys to, you know, identify spaces for divergence from the United States. I'm just not sure. But again, I don't think those decisions are going to be made because of preferences in Iran policy. They're going to be made because of the core of the now changed transatlantic relationship. And then the last thing I would say is just to come back to this framework of, you know, weakness and stubbornness. I guess we would reopen the question of whether what Europe has demonstrated is weakness or prioritization. So there are other sanctions areas where Europe has stood up to the United States and won. So, for example, Rusal. Did you not do that on Iran because you didn't have the tools to do it? Or did you not do it on Iran because while it was a political priority, it wasn't an economic one? And so I think you again would sort of enter this question of, does this reshake priorities? Are there things that Europe would be willing to do or risk that you weren't willing to do last time around? I don't have answers to any of those questions. I just think that they're the framework to think about them.
Well, thank you. But you're giving us a lot of food for thought. Should this situation arise? Anise, my last question would have been, you know, where is Iran on the list of priorities for the Europeans if and when there is a Trump administration? So your concluding thoughts would be much appreciated.
Thank you, Cornelius, and thank you everyone for a very interesting discussion. I certainly enjoyed that, and thank you and Carnegie also for partnering with us on this. I just wanted to conclude by saying just a few words on Iran as well, if I may, on the Trump scenario. I think, you know, first of all, Iran is not excluding that option at all. And actually, some within the IRGC prefer that option because it would help them strengthen their hand, especially in late elections, but also it would help them, you know, basically portray themselves as the defender of the nation and pursue their preferences for self-sufficiency and continue with non-improving ties, especially with the US, but also with little success on the European front. So I think, you know, like it's not something that they are not calculating at all. Obviously, as everyone has said, there is a lot of unpredictability in terms of what it means. But I think there is a positive side to that outcome from the Iranian side, which is the continuation of the isolation and the maintenance of the moral high ground that Natalie referred to when it comes to Iran over the past 4 years. I think this is something that would be definitely appealing from the Iranian side. Obviously, when it comes to economic relief pressure, that is, you know, something that is not good in terms of prospect from Iran, but they calculated that they can live under the current situation for at least another year. So I think a lot can happen in the next year. And I think building up on what was mentioned also from the European side, I also agree that I don't see the falling into line as the necessary outcome or conclusion, even under a Trump administration. I think there might be actually, and there is talks about the necessity to move actually into a more strategic autonomy direction should another 4 years of Trump be the direction in which things are. And I think, you know, exactly along the lines of what Jared mentioned, there might be considerations, steps, actions that have not been taken over the past 4 years that will be taken because, you know, 4 years is quite a long time to survive another, you know, secondary sanction pressure exerted by Trump, and especially the really looming and very, very little prospects for any kind of improvement on the regional, but also on the nuclear side. So I think there might be actually a push for a more strategic autonomy direction on the European side. I don't think there would be a weakening of Iran from the European agenda, especially on the nuclear side, because this has been the priority. We have to remind everyone since 2003. I don't see that really fading away, even if the Trump scenario comes out.
Thank you, Annecy, and also thank you for these words of encouragement. So there is a lot to work on and a lot more to discuss. We're all waiting for the results to come in as of next Tuesday evening. Thank you very much again to all the speakers, Nathalie Tocci, Jared Blank, Tom Tugendhat, and my dear colleague Anissé Tabrizi. Thanks for your time, your insights. Thanks to the audience for tuning in, for stimulating the discussion with your questions and comments. Apologies if we couldn't get them all, but we're very happy to have had you and to see you around next time with RUSI, with Carnegie, with the IAA, I may include. Have a good afternoon, good evening, and see you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all so much.